on the history of Lovers Lane. And the first time I scripted it out and sort of read it to myself, it was 35 minutes long. And I knew, well, that wouldn't give Ken very much time. So I started shrinking it down, so it's a little bit of a work in process. But, and so I kind of boiled it down to really, it focuses more on the history of our facilities and, you know, where we started on Lovers Lane and where we come to. So if you please watch this video.
In late summer 1944, Bill Scroggins, a student attending SMU's School of Theology, was appointed by the district superintendent to begin to survey the area east of Love Field to see if the time was right to organize a Methodist church in that part of Dallas. And on October 4th, 1944, a small group gathered at the home of William Earl Norris at 4711 West Lovers Lane to make plans to organize a new church called Lovers Lane Methodist Church. The church was formally organized on Friday evening, November 17, 1944, by a quarterly conference at the Norris home. On the last day of January 1945, a vacant home at 3924 Parkside was rented for $65 a month as a temporary home for services until the building committee and board of stewards could raise enough money to build something more permanent on Lovers Lane. The first service was held there on February 4, 1945. Plans, architect drawings, budgets, and fundraising efforts began to come together for what would be the church buildings on Lovers Lane. However, fundraising efforts fell short of the amount needed, so the Board of Stewards turned to Marshall Steele, senior pastor at Highland Park Methodist Church, for help. Dr. Steele and Highland Park Methodist Church agreed to help, pledging $500 a year for 5 years to be applied to the principal of a loan Dr. Steele helped them obtain. Highland Park also agreed to pay $1,800 a year toward the Lovers Lane pastor's salary until the church could assume that responsibility. But there was a catch. All this was contingent on Lovers Lane having a full-time pastor. Bill Scroggins had not yet completed his theology school studies, so he could only be a part-time pastor. So, Lovers Lane asked Dr. Steele if he had anyone in mind. Dr. Steele replied, "We have an up-and-coming young minister on our staff who wants a church of his own. He is awfully good with young couples, and I think he would be a good man for you. His name is Tom Shipp." After much discussion, Lovers Lane voted to bring on Tom Shipp. On October 28, 1945, Bishop Charles C. Seligman assigned Thomas Joel Shipp as full-time pastor at Lovers Lane Methodist Church. The initial step in the master plan called for the construction of a chapel, and construction of it was moving forward during the summer of 1946, and on Sunday, October 20th, 1946, the first service was held in the chapel at 5002 West Lovers Lane. Temporary buildings were added for Sunday school classes, and in January of 1949, plans began to come together for the second major step in the master plan, an interim sanctuary that would eventually become a 2-story educational building after the permanent sanctuary was built. Fundraising began with a building campaign for the new structures, and the first services were held in the new interim sanctuary on March 8, 1953. But the church soon outgrew the existing facilities, and plans were made to build a new permanent sanctuary. Construction costs were estimated to be $500,000, which included the new sanctuary, a fellowship hall, and funds to convert the existing temporary sanctuary into an education building. On March 2, 1958, the congregation occupied the new permanent sanctuary at 5002 West Lovers Lane with a seating capacity of 1,100. But by May 1959, concerns began to develop about whether the present site would be sufficient to serve the church in the future, and by the start of 1960, Lovers Lane was beginning to look at alternative sites. On April 19, 1960, W.O. Bankston and Tom Shipp flew to Albuquerque to meet with Billy Binion, who owned 6.6 acres on Northwest Highway. Mr. Binion lived in Las Vegas. Tom would not go to Las Vegas, and Mr. Binion would not come to Dallas, so they met in Albuquerque. Tom and W.O. Bankston put down $10 and signed a contract to purchase the property for $135,000. In 1959, Reverend Kennon Callahan became an assistant pastor, and by 1960, he began to play an important role with the planning committee for the new site on Northwest Highway. Ken was instrumental in much of the research and study that was undertaken in the planning process, and on April 16, 1962, Ken was part of a small team that presented recommendations and illustrations of what the church might look like in its new location. The plan to relocate was approved at that meeting, and at a called session of the quarterly conference on February 11, 1963, the plan to move was approved. Planning began for the new location. Through lots of starts and stops in the planning process, some reconsiderations, several votes, on February 25, 1970, the contract to build the first phase of the new site was approved, and the groundbreaking took place on March 15, 1970. The first phase included Asbury Hall as a fellowship hall that would serve as the sanctuary until the permanent sanctuary was built. Asbury Hall had seating for 1,150 movable chairs. The first services of worship were held in Asbury Hall on Sunday morning, August 8, 1971 at 9:30 and 11 o'clock a.m. The first phase included 3 educational buildings with Epworth Hall serving as the main entrance. And the first phase included Oxford Hall and Wesley Chapel. Wesley Chapel had pews that would seat a little more than 100 people. The permanent sanctuary was not to be constructed until 1979. The new sanctuary was named the Pollard and Sharon Simons Sanctuary. Pollard Simon, a man of Jewish faith, contributed $1.5 million towards the construction cost of just over $3 million. The first service in the new sanctuary was held on January 14, 1979. The Center for Spiritual Development across Northwest Highway was purchased in 1984, and the Meadowbrook parking property was purchased in 1991. With the walking bridge completed in 2001. The Christ Family Center groundbreaking was held in June 2000 and dedicated on August 19, 2001, along with Benton Garden. Shipp Chapel was consecrated on December 6, 2009, and the chapel organ was consecrated in 2011. And Aldersgate Hall and Watson Hall were completed in December of 2009. Shepherd's Garden and the Columbarium were opened September 25, 2013. And finally, Serenity House, now called the Copeland House, opened in October 2013. And the future holds much more promise of gifts of God for Lovers Lane United Methodist Church. Let's welcome Senior Pastor Stan Copeland to introduce Dr. Kennon Callahan, who will share some thoughts on Lovers Lane's future gifts of God.
All right. Thank you very much to the foundation for that history in 7 minutes, Paul? That was pretty good. 75 years in 7 minutes. Really good. You know, we are so pleased tonight to be able to gather at another wonderful Shipp Lecture Series and dinner tonight. And we always want to thank Phil and Teresa for their generosity that has made this dinner possible tonight, and all of you who've contributed extra to make this such a success. So thank you so much, Phil and Teresa and the rest, for all that you do for our church. You know, tonight we have a special privilege to hear from Ken Callahan. Ken, as you know from this morning, has been on our staff, so he has a unique perspective on Lovers Lane. Unlike any other Shipp lecturer we've had, Ken has seen this church from the inside at a very crucial time in our history. As you know, Julie and Ken moved here with the little one in 1958 and began to work here at Lovers Lane at that time. You know, in reading about Ken and his work, it seems like there is always one theme that rises to the top related to his professional endeavors, and that is the theme of teacher. I even noticed that when he enlisted in the Navy, the United States Navy, in 1954, where he served for the next 8 years in a reserve capacity, some of those years, he was called upon to be a teacher of the other sailors related to some of their unique work on the ship. We, as clergy, know Ken as a consummate teacher. Many have sat in his classrooms even when he was working on his doctorate at Candler School of Theology in Emory, where there in the Atlanta area, through Emory, has developed some really exceptional continuing education courses that he, in fact, has founded. And in the North Georgia Conference, one of our strongest conferences in the country, many of my friends who are there point to Ken Callahan as a catalyst for the growth and development of that conference. You know, I know so many friends. I did my doctorate back in the early 90s through United in Dayton, Ohio, but we went through the courses together as a group, and my group was 75% from North Georgia. So we would travel over to Atlanta and we would study. Lynn Sweet, who's also been a lecturer for the Shipp Lectures, would come down. And so I have kept up with my North Georgia colleagues, many of whom sing Ken's praises over and over and over again, as do many of my friends here in Texas. One of those, Tim Walker, I think, has had Ken to lead workshops and conferences for other clergy some 6 or 7 times. And it's just amazing the kind of impact he has had on leadership within the church. And of course, his book that we mentioned this morning, 12 Keys to the Effective Church, has been a staple for so many years in seminary and in church studies, and it has made such a huge difference. And that is just one of 24 books that he has shared. And each and every one of those books is bent toward teaching. You know, Ken, I want to thank you, not just on behalf of Lovers Lane, but on behalf of the larger United Methodist Church and really the larger Christian church, for the way that you have given so much of your life, so much of your time to raise the bar for churches, for our clergy and our lay leadership, to be all that Christ would intend for our churches to be. And I want to say that we really do owe you a great debt of gratitude, and what a privilege it is to have you standing in this Asbury Hall that was once our sanctuary here at Lovers Lane, and to speak to us again. So may God bless you as you come forward now. Let's give Ken a hand.
Stay here. Good friends, Julie and I want to gift this copy of 12 Keys to an Effective Church to Lovers Lane. Now, the book was published in 1983, and we saved a few of the original first printings. So that is what this book is. And 12 Keys has been translated into Korean, Mandarin Chinese, Spanish, a language in Africa. It has covered Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Africa, Central America. The book has a life of its own. And it's been an amazing adventure to watch the book go forward. And we wanted the library of Lovers Lane to have an original print copy. We've inscribed it, and we give it to you, and we are honored to be able to do so.
Thank you. Thank you. What a gift.
A way to think about it is 12 Keys is Lovers Lane. Lovers Lane is 12 Keys. Julie and I found our way to Lovers Lane in September of 1958. It's kind of interesting. We had our first date in 1954. We married in 1956. We came to Lovers Lane in 1958. In the early days of our being here, Tom and Dee and the staff, we would have new member receptions at Tom and Dee's home. Someone would inevitably ask, how did Lovers Lane get its name as a church? And Tom would say, the church got its name for the street. The street got its name for what you precisely know it got its name. It was the Lovers Lane in North Dallas. Got so bad they decided to put a church on it. All we tried to do is get people to come back out and park again on Sunday. Or we did have an 8 a.m. service. You could stay through the night and come to that service. 80 to 100 years ago, there was a lane in North Dallas. And there was nobody on that lane. It went to the Love Farm. And it became a place where some people of a Friday or a Saturday night would come and park. Across the years, I've actually met 3 couples who confessed to me that they began their romance on Lovers Lane. Now, by definition, a Lovers Lane is an inaccessible, non-visible, hard to find place. I mean, nobody does their parking on a main highway. They park on a lane. So if you would think about open accessibility, high visibility, adequate land, landscaping, and parking, and adequate space and facilities, you would know that in that time, when Lovers Lane was founded, the old notions of church plantings were beginning to disappear. Following the war in 1945, the notion of church planting was, build it and they will come. And so lots of annual conferences looked for sites that had open accessibility, high visibility, adequate land, landscaping, parking, and place for adequate space and facilities. And church growth went forward merrily and happily with build it and they will come. Lovers Lane was founded in the beginnings of the end of that era of church growth. And there were beginning to be places that had open accessibility and high visibility and land, landscaping, parking, and potential adequate space and facilities that would get started and would become stable and declining and dying and die. It no longer really worked. Build it and they will come. So in the 12 Keys book, you will find what I now call the gifts of Lovers Lane. So in the 12 Keys, the functional characteristics are program, accessibility, visibility, parking, space, facilities, and finances. The gifts, the relational characteristics, are mission, shepherding, worship, groupings, leadership, and decision making. And what I want to confirm with you tonight is that it's essentially the first four that are the extraordinary gifts of Lovers Lane. Mission. Lovers Lane taught me that congregations that discovered one helpful, legendary mission became visible and accessible on the community grapevine. The early mission of Lovers Lane had something to do with helping people who wrestle with alcoholism. And Lovers Lane on the community grapevine of Dallas became a legend for its helpfulness with families and people who wrestled desperately with the addiction of alcoholism. Now, some churches have the notion that they need to do lots and lots and lots of things in mission. And I help churches that have figured out on their own how to try and do 97 different missions. But it's sort of like if you and I were at a university earning a degree. People who have one major, or maybe two, and several minors, 1, 2, or 3, and some electives, tend to graduate from the university. People who have 97 majors never graduate. They actually end up delivering the mediocre middle on all 97. The art is to deliver 1 or 2 that are major missions on the community grapevine. So I'm helping churches, and I will say to them, teach me, when the name of your church is spoken in the community, what comes to people's mind? Oh, that's the church that helps alcoholics. Oh, that's the church that helps kids. Mostly people, congregations become known on the community grapevine for 1 or 2, maybe 3, for which they are legends. And Lovers Lane's early gift had to do with a compelling, legendary mission. The second gift of Lovers Lane is its compassion for shepherding. In the early days, Tom and Dee and Merle and Roberta and Glenn and Virginia and Olive and Cecil and on and on and on were legends for helping people with their human hurts and hopes. In hospitals, in homes, goes on and on and on. The gift of shepherding. What people want to have the sense of is not how many busy programs and activities are available. It's more like, what is the experience of sharing and caring shepherding that people discover with a congregation? Now, I am with some congregations who, when they do their announcements on Sunday, announce the busy, bustling programs and activities that go on throughout the whole of the week, more than we could participate in 4 lifetimes. And I am with congregations who speak of birthdays and anniversaries and people in hospitals and people struggling with this or that human hurt and hope. And I know I am there with a shepherding congregation. It is a gift. Church growth has created, regrettably, the notion that the purpose of life is to grow bigger churches. No, the purpose of life is to help people live richly and fully through this life's pilgrimage. The third gift of Lovers Lane is worship. Stirring, inspiring music. Helpful, encouraging preaching. Strong, healthy services of worship. Lovers Lane, across its 75 years, has mostly done worship quite differently than most other congregations on the planet. It's not so much, quote, Methodist. The difference is a people-centered, person-centered focus on people's lives and destinies, and the grace of God, the peace of Christ, and the hope of the Holy Spirit. Worship at Lovers Lane is person-centered. It's not program-centered. It's not, quote, denominational-centered. The purpose of worship at Lovers Lane is to help people live whole, healthy lives in the grace, peace, and hope of God. The fourth gift of Lovers Lane is groupings. Now, in an earlier age, Sylvia, membership secretary, and yours truly, took the 5,676 members present at that time and organized all of them into geographical neighborhood groups. And we discovered that about half the groups worked, and about half the groups did not work. So we spent a lot of time trying to figure out why the groups that did not work. And then we were wiser, and we decided to focus on why are the groups that are working? I mean, what are we doing well? And what we discovered is that in the groups that worked, they worked not because they were geographical, but because they were relational. And they just happened to live in the same geographical neighborhood. So then we thought better and wiser, and we began to organize groupings based on who would have fun being in a grouping with who. And we focused on relational groupings. And people found home and family and community in those groupings. Now, people found home and family in the groupings of our Sunday school classes and our AA groups. And it goes on and on and on. What people long for in a congregation is roots, place, belonging, family, sharing and caring, home. I honor that the fifth gift, leadership, is an extraordinary blessing of Lovers Lane. Lovers Lane, across 75 years, has been blessed with some extraordinarily remarkable leaders. And we give thanks for all of them. The sixth gift, decision-making. Lovers Lane figured out how to make decisions simply and effectively and fully. I am with some congregations who take 3 years to make a 3-day decision. You and I could make that decision happily and graciously in 3 days. Some people figure out how to do 3 years. They create for themselves what I call analysis paralysis. They keep thinking it through again and again and again and again, somehow imagining that by paralyzing their decisions, they will make an excellent decision. What happens is the time is gone, the moment is lost, and we are now weaker and in a more difficult strait. I teach my basketball teams. When you're ready to shoot, shoot. Don't think about the shot. Just picture it going in, and it will. If you think too long about the shot, it will hit the rim and bounce. Same in golf. If you are ready to hit, and you begin to think about the mechanics of the swing, we will now get to go and hunt for the ball. The best shots, and this is true with the pros, and it's true with everybody. The best shots happen when you don't think the shot. You simply, with a gracious move, swing. Now, I have helped congregations who've been wrestling over decisions for 10 years. And they're mostly two-cell churches. 2 cells. The old-timers came years upon years ago, and they were 1 cell. And then the newcomers came. Now, the newcomers came 20 years ago, but from the point of view of the old-timers, they're the newcomers. And the best thing 2-cell churches do is fight. And I was helping one church, and they said to me, Dr. Callahan, please help us. Someone has moved the kitchen utensils from where they've always been. I said, I'll be glad to help. Work it out with Julie for me to come about every 6 months. What do you mean? Well, you're a 2-cell church. For the moment, you're fighting over the kitchen utensils. There'll be a period of resting up, renewing our energies, and about 6 months later, we'll figure out some other fight. Somebody moved the table from where it's always been. I said, well, what is the solution? I said, well, you've been doing this since this group showed up 20 years ago. Solution to a 2-cell church is 3 cells. A 3-cell church still fights, and they take turns. They fight around. And a church that is 4, 5, 6, 10, 20, 50, 150 cells, we'll still have our fair share of fights. And at the same time, we will have more a spirit of family together. And our decision-making will move. Now, in that early time, we had come to discover that the old location would never have accessibility, visibility, adequate land, landscaping, parking. We tried to buy the auto dealership next door. We tried to buy the block south. 3 houses would not sell. We tried to buy the Dobbs house clear to Inwood Road. We couldn't do that. We did buy the lot across the street, and Ed Mullenix lived in the house next door. Harrison Baker and I, he had an airplane, one Sunday morning, he and I flew from Love Field. You could do it then. And we flew over the church before the 8 o'clock and the 9:25, the 10:55. I took the pictures while Harrison kept us in the air. And we, from that vantage point, began to discover things you could not figure out on the ground. We discovered that at 9 o'clock, when the 8 o'clock service was over, the people who were leaving the 9 o'clock service had not yet left, and the people coming at 9:25 had already showed up. It's sort of overflow parking puzzles. And we valiantly tried every way we could to make the old location work. We just couldn't figure it out. So the decision came, what makes good sense is to find a location that has open accessibility and high visibility and landscaping, parking, adequate space and facilities. Without losing our gifts of mission and shepherding and worship and groupings and leaders and decision making. Because if we found all the land we could and all the parking, but we lost these gifts, we would be no better off than 200 other churches across the country who had all of this and none of this. Do you begin to see it? I mean, a group of people make a family. They may live in a house, but the house doesn't make a home. The people do. Now, Julie and I have done 7 trips, she's 6, to Australia and New Zealand, 3 months each trip. We have been in every province of Canada. We have been in every state in the United States. We will have, the end of this month, a group coming from South Africa. This will be the 12th grouping that Mullen and Marlise Nell have brought to spend time with us. We have been all over. I want you to know Lovers Lane is a most remarkable, extraordinary, amazing congregation. You are blessed to have the privilege of being a part of the Lovers Lane congregation. You live in hope. You live with your gifts. If you could say 2 things about Lovers Lane, we are the people who live with overflowing hope, and we are the people who build on the gifts with which God blesses us. And Julie and I are most grateful to have the privilege of sharing this life's pilgrimage with you. It's an amazing journey God gifts to us. This last note. We have regrettably many denominations that have become preoccupied with policies and procedures, rules and regulations, conditions and stipulations, on and on and on. Teaching at Emory University in Atlanta, Georgia, one of my good friends, we would play chess together, a retired bishop. He is the one who in the early years wrote half of the discipline. He always thought the venture was a book of good manners. This is what people who have good manners share with one another. He would never have imagined the litigious, complexities that have emerged. People are not drawn to policies and procedures, rules and regulations, conditions and stipulations.
Amen.
In the early years, Julie and I visited the Cyberlene estate, Akron, Ohio. We grew up in Cuyahoga Falls next door. Mrs. Cyberlene is the one who gathered Dr. Bob and Bill W. And they were going to have a 20-minute conversation that lasted for 6 hours, and the founding of AA. And we were at the Cyberlene estate on a visit somewhere in, the late 1950s. And a lovely woman showed us around. And there's the carriage house. The carriage house is a big room, not quite this big, but it's a big room. And she was among the early 100 recovering alcoholics who gathered. And this was a time of policies and procedures. Oh, thank you. Good for you. And this group gathered to think through what would be the policies and procedures, rules and regulations. And somewhere along the way, they came up with 61. Someone came up with Rule 62. And they threw away all the others and adopted Rule 62. Now, there are two versions of it. One version is, we will not take ourselves too damn seriously. The gentler version is, we will not take ourselves too seriously. What is at stake is, it's an addictive, compulsive perfectionism that got us into this mess. We're not going to create another compulsive, addictive perfectionism towards 62, 63, 100 rules and regulations. We're going to have traditions, and we're going to have 12 steps. Lovers Lane is a congregation that lives on hope and lives on its gifts. Julie and I are grateful and thankful for you. God bless you.